He walked through a bus terminal holding his fiancée's hand, a place a man like him would never be. Junho Kang didn't ride buses. He didn't stand in crowds. Men bowed when he entered a room. Blood had been spilled in his name. Fortunes destroyed with a single word. Tonight he was untouchable. Until he saw her. The woman from 4 years ago. The one he broke deliberately. The one he made sure would never come back. She was standing near gate 12, her body curved around 3 small children like she was shielding them from the world. Or from him. When one of the boys looked up, Junho felt something he hadn't felt in years. Fear. Not because the child recognized him, but because Junho recognized the child. His fiancée's voice cut through the noise. "Are they yours?" He couldn't answer. Because 4 years ago he made a choice. A brutal one. The kind of choice that saves a life by destroying it. And now that choice was staring back at him. With his eyes. Subscribe before this gets darker. And drop a comment telling me where you're watching from and what time it is right now. Because the next 9 minutes will show you what happens when the most dangerous man in Seoul realizes the one person he couldn't protect was the one he pushed away. Some secrets don't stay buried. They grow up. And they come back. Junho Kang was a man who learned early that mercy was expensive and forgiveness was something only the weak could afford. By the time he was 32, half of Seoul's underground whispered his name with the kind of respect that came from fear, not admiration. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. When Junho entered a room, conversations stopped. Deals were finalized. Problems disappeared. He had built an empire on the understanding that power wasn't loud. It was absolute. It was the kind of power that didn't apologize, didn't explain, and certainly didn't walk through public bus terminals on a Thursday night. But here he was. The charity gala was across town, and his driver had suggested cutting through the terminal to avoid road construction on the main boulevard. Junho had agreed without thinking much of it. Nothing in a place like this could touch him. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead, flickering occasionally like dying insects. The smell of diesel fuel mixed with cheap coffee and something vaguely metallic. People shuffled past with worn backpacks and tired faces, the kind of people who counted coins before buying food, who fell asleep on buses because home was still 3 transfers away. It was a world Junho had left behind decades ago, and had no intention of revisiting. Beside him, Seoyun moved with the kind of grace that came from a lifetime of expensive ballet lessons and family expectations. Her red dress was tailored perfectly, her hair pinned in a way that looked effortless but had taken an hour. She was beautiful in the way museums were beautiful. Something to admire from a distance, something that confirmed status. The engagement ring on her finger caught the light as she gestured towards something amusing, a street vendor selling knockoff designer bags near the exit. Junho smiled at the appropriate moments, nodded when expected, played the role of the attentive fiancé with practiced ease. This marriage made sense. Her family had connections. His family had power. Together they would build something untouchable. Love was never part of the equation. Love was the thing Junho had buried 4 years ago, when he learned that caring about someone made you vulnerable in ways no amount of money or muscle could protect against. He had made a choice back then. A brutal, necessary choice. The kind that left scars no one else could see. He told himself it was the right decision. He told himself he'd saved a life by walking away. He told himself that some sacrifices were worth the weight they left behind. He believed love was a weakness he had cut out of himself like a tumor, something that would have killed him if he'd let it grow. Tonight, walking through this forgettable terminal with a woman who would never demand anything real from him, Junho felt certain he had chosen correctly. Power didn't betray you. Power didn't bleed. Power didn't show up 4 years later and force you to remember everything you destroyed to survive. Until it did. It happened between one breath and the next. Junho was mid-step, Seoyun still talking about something inconsequential, when his eyes caught movement near gate 12. A woman adjusting a backpack. Nothing unusual. Nothing that should have mattered. But the way she moved made him look twice. There was a deliberateness to her posture, a tension in her shoulders like someone bracing against an impact that hadn't come yet. He knew that stance. Had seen it 1,000 times in a life he thought he'd erased. Then she turned. Time didn't stop the way it did in movies. It fractured. Split into jagged pieces that cut on the way down. Hygiene. Her hair was shorter now, pulled back in a way that looked hasty, functional rather than stylish. Her face had changed. The softness around her jaw was gone, replaced by sharper angles, the kind that came from too many skipped meals and too much stress. But her eyes were the same. Dark and watchful. The eyes that used to search his face in the dark, looking for reassurance he didn't know how to give. She looked older. Not just 4 years older. Worn older. Survived older. Junho's pulse turned erratic. His hand, still loosely holding Seo-yun's arm, went numb. Then he saw the children. 3 of them. Small. Sitting in a neat row on the bench beside her like soldiers waiting for orders. One clutched a stuffed rabbit that had seen better days, its ear hanging by a thread. Another swung his legs absently, feet not quite reaching the ground. The third leaned against Hyejine's side, half asleep, face pressed into her jacket. They were maybe 3 years old. Maybe 4. Junho's brain tried to do math it didn't want to complete. The boy with the rabbit looked up first. Just a casual glance, the way children look at strangers in public spaces. Curious but uninterested. Then his eyes locked onto Junho's. And the world tilted. It wasn't similarity. It wasn't coincidence. It was recognition without understanding. A mirror held up by genetics. The shape of the boy's eyes. The exact slant. The way his eyebrows sat just slightly uneven. The small divot below his lower lip. Junho had seen that face every morning in the mirror for 32 years. The second child turned next. A girl. Same eyes. Same serious expression. She frowned slightly, sensing something she couldn't name, some invisible thread pulling her attention toward a stranger who shouldn't matter. Then the third. The one leaning against Hygiene. He lifted his head slowly, blinked away sleep, and stared. All 3 of them. Staring back at him. With his face. His eyes. His blood. The terminal noise faded into static. Seo-yun's voice became distant. Unintelligible. Junho felt his chest tighten, air refusing to move properly through his lungs. He didn't remember letting go of Seo-yun's arm. Didn't remember taking a step forward. Didn't remember his lips parting as if to speak. Because there were no words for this. Hygiene saw him then. Their eyes met across 20 feet of concrete and 4 years of silence. And she did something that destroyed him more than anger ever could. She looked away. No shock. No gasp. No recognition that mattered. She simply gathered the children closer, stood up, and turned her back. Like he was nothing. Like he'd already been buried. Hygiene saw him 3 seconds before he saw her. She was counting the children the way she always did, a silent tally that had become reflex. 1, 2, 3. All accounted for. All safe. Then her peripheral vision caught movement that didn't belong. Expensive shoes on dirty concrete. A tailored suit in a place where people wore second-hand jackets. She knew before she looked up. The body remembers what the mind tries to forget. 4 years hadn't erased the way he moved, that careful controlled grace that made other men step aside without being asked. 4 years hadn't erased the shape of his shoulders or the way he held his head like someone who never had to bow. She looked up and there he was. Junho Kang. The man who told her she meant nothing. The man who walked away without looking back. The man whose face she saw every single day in 3 small mirrors that asked her for snacks and held her hand and called her mama. He had a woman on his arm. Beautiful. Polished. The kind of woman who never had to choose between electricity and groceries. Red dress. Diamond ring. Perfect. Hygiene felt nothing. Not the sharp shock she'd imagined in the early days when she still thought about running into him. Not the rage that had kept her awake during the first trimester when morning sickness felt like punishment. Not even the grief that had hollowed her out when she gave birth alone, gripping a stranger's hand and whispering apologies to babies who didn't understand why their father wasn't there. She felt nothing because she'd already survived the worst thing he could do to her. And she'd done it 3 times over. She watched him notice. Watched his eyes track from her face to the children. Watched the exact moment recognition hit. His expression fractured in a way she'd never seen before, not even when he was lying to her, not even when he was destroying them both with words designed to make her leave. Minjun looked up first, curious about whatever had stolen her attention. Then Sua. Then little Jaehoon, blinking away sleep. All 3 of them staring at the stranger who'd stopped breathing. Hygien's hand moved on instinct, pulling them closer. Not yanking. Not panicking. Just gathering them the way she learned to do when the world felt unstable, when landlords knocked too hard or when grocery money ran out 3 days before payday. Her backpack was already on her shoulder. The bus was boarding. Gate 12. Right on time. She stood without hurrying, without dramatics, and ushered the children toward the steps. Minjun climbed first, then Sua, then Jaehoon, who needed help because his legs were still too short. She counted them onto the bus the way she counted them everywhere. 1, 2, 3. She didn't look back. Not when she heard movement behind her. Not when she felt the weight of his stare. Not when every instinct screamed that he was following. She sat down. Buckled Jaehoon into the seat beside her. Adjusted Minjun's jacket. Handed Sua the stuffed rabbit. Normal things. Routine things. The things she did every day because these children needed stability more than they needed explanations about men who chose power over love. The bus doors closed. Through the window she could see him standing there. Still frozen. Still staring. And Hygiene turned her face away. Because 4 years ago he'd forfeited the right to speak. And no amount of shock or regret could buy that right back. The apartment was 30 minutes from the bus terminal by bus and another 10 on foot. Hygiene counted steps the way she counted everything else now. Steps meant distance. Distance meant safety. Distance meant he couldn't follow. The building was old, the kind where paint peeled in long strips and the stairwell smelled like mildew and someone else's cooking. 3rd floor. No elevator. She carried Jaehoon because his legs gave out after the first flight. Minjun and Sua climbed ahead, practiced, counting steps out loud the way she'd taught them. 1, 2, 3. Make a game of everything. Make survival feel normal. Inside, the apartment was smaller than it looked in her memory. 1 bedroom for the 3 of them. A couch that folded out for her. A kitchen with 2 working burners. The fridge hummed too loud and the bathroom faucet dripped no matter how tight she turned it. But the rent was cheap. Or it had been. Until it wasn't. Dinner was rice and eggs. Again. She stretched 2 eggs across 4 plates, mixed in yesterday's vegetables, added soy sauce to make it taste like something intentional. Minjun ate without complaint. Sua pushed hers around, tired but obedient. Jaehoon coughed. The same wet cough he'd had for a week. The same cough the clinic said needed antibiotics she couldn't afford yet. She'd bought half the prescription. Rationed the pills. 2 more days and he'd finish the course. 2 more days and the cough would stop. It had to. After dinner she washed dishes in cold water because hot water cost extra. She folded laundry that had dried on the radiator. She checked homework Minjun didn't have yet but would soon. She read them a story from the library, the same book they'd read 12 times because returning it meant walking 30 minutes each way, and she didn't have 30 minutes to spare. She tucked them into the 1 bed they shared. 1, 2, 3. All accounted for. All breathing. Jaehoon coughed again, and she pressed her hand to his forehead. Still warm. Not burning. Not yet. Her phone buzzed on the counter. She ignored it the way she ignored most things that couldn't be solved with the money she didn't have. It buzzed again. Then a 3rd time. She picked it up. The screen lit with notifications that felt like bullets. Eviction notice. 30 days. Rent 3 months overdue. Below that, another message. From the state. A follow-up appointment she'd missed last week because Minjun had been sick and she couldn't leave him. A warning about compliance. A mention of child welfare services. A date circled in red. Mandatory. Or else. Hygiene set the phone down carefully. Her hands didn't shake anymore. They'd done all their shaking 4 years ago, when she was young enough to believe crying changed anything. She looked at the children sleeping in the bed that was too small for 3. At the apartment that was about to disappear. At the life she'd built from nothing with no help and no mercy. She didn't survive. She endured. And tomorrow she'd do it again. If you're still here, type "I'm still watching" in the comments. Because what happens next will show you that some men don't get second chances. They get reckonings. 4 years earlier, Junho destroyed her in 17 minutes. They were in his apartment, the one with floor-to-ceiling windows that overlooked the Han River. She'd come because he asked her to. Because he said they needed to talk. Because she still believed talking meant solving problems together. He didn't sit down. Didn't offer her tea. Didn't touch her the way he used to, carefully, like she might break. He stood near the window with his back to the lights so she couldn't see his face clearly, and he told her it was over. She asked why. He said there was no why. Some things just ended. She asked if there was someone else. He said it didn't matter. She asked if she'd done something wrong. He laughed. Not cruelly. Worse. Tiredly. Like she was exhausting him with questions that had no good answers. Then he said the words that would replay in her head for 4 years. You were convenient. That's all this ever was. A distraction. Something easy while I had time for easy things. I don't anymore. She stood there trying to understand how convenience could have looked like love. How distraction could have felt like safety. How easy could have meant the way he held her after nightmares or remembered she didn't like coffee or kissed her forehead when he thought she was sleeping. He kept talking. Kept dismantling her piece by piece with a voice that never rose, never cracked, never gave her anything to hold on to. You're not built for this life. You're not strong enough. You want things I can't give you, and I'm tired of pretending I care about any of it. Leave. Don't call. Don't come back. We're done. She left. She didn't cry until she reached the street. 6 weeks later she took a pregnancy test in a public bathroom. 8 weeks later a doctor told her there were 3 heartbeats. She thought about calling him. Thought about it every day for a month. Then she remembered his voice. Convenient. Distraction. Not strong enough. So she carried them alone. Worked until her body screamed. Hid the pregnancy under oversized clothes until hiding became impossible. She gave birth on a Tuesday in a hospital where she knew no one. The pain was biblical. Unending. She gripped a nurse's hand and sobbed through contractions that felt like her body was tearing itself apart. When they finally came, small and red and screaming, the nurse asked about the father. About family. About who to call. Hygiene said no one. She named them by herself in a recovery room that smelled like antiseptic and failure. Minjun because it meant clever and gentle. Sua because it meant excellent and elegant. Jaehoon because it meant talent and rank. She gave them names that meant something. Names that promised futures. Names their father would never say. She looked at their faces and saw him everywhere. In their eyes. In the shape of their mouths. In the way Minjun frowned even as a newborn, like he was already disappointed with the world. And she understood that some lies don't just break you once. They break you every single day. Forever. Seo-yun felt him stop before she saw why. One moment they were walking, his hand steady on her arm, his attention half present the way it usually was during these public outings. The next moment he'd gone completely still. Not frozen. Arrested. Like someone had cut his strings mid-step. She followed his gaze. A woman. Thin. Exhausted looking. Standing near a bench with 3 small children clustered around her like planets in orbit. Nothing remarkable. Nothing that should have mattered to a man like Junho Kang. But Seo-yun hadn't survived 20 years in families like theirs by being oblivious. She watched him watch the woman. Watched color drain from his face in a way she'd never seen. Watched his jaw tighten and his breathing change and his pupils dilate like he'd been struck. Then one of the children looked up. A boy. Maybe 3 or 4 years old. Dark hair. serious expression, and eyes that Seo-yun recognized immediately because she'd been staring into identical ones for the past 6 months. She looked at the other 2 children. A girl. Another boy. Same eyes. Same slight asymmetry in the eyebrows. Same small divot below the lower lip. The resemblance wasn't subtle. It was genetic. Undeniable. She felt her own breathing shift. Not panic. Calculation. This was a problem. Problems required assessment before action. The woman gathered the children and moved toward a bus. Quickly. Deliberately. Like she was fleeing. Junho took a step forward. Stopped. His hand had fallen away from Seo-yun's arm. He looked lost. Actually lost. It was unsettling. Seo-yun had been raised to marry power, not love. Her parents had been very clear about that distinction. Love was a pleasant bonus. Power was the foundation. Junho represented consolidation of 2 influential families, business opportunities that would span decades, social positioning that would elevate both their names. She didn't love him. She didn't need to. What she needed was for him to be exactly who he appeared to be. Controlled. Calculated. Uncomplicated by the kind of messy emotional entanglements that destroyed carefully constructed futures. The bus pulled away. Junho stood there watching it disappear like a man watching his own execution. Seo-yun waited. Let the silence stretch. Let him feel the weight of whatever this was. When she finally spoke, her voice was perfectly calm. Dinner party calm. Negotiation calm. The kind of calm that preceded declarations of war. Are they yours? 3 words. Simple question. But the space between them contained everything. His reputation. Her family's expectations. The engagement announcement that had already been sent to every major publication. The wedding venue booked for spring. The merger her father had orchestrated specifically around this union. Junho didn't answer. That was answer enough. Seo-yun stood in a bus terminal that smelled like diesel and desperation and recalculated her entire future in the span of 6 seconds. Then she did what women in her position had been doing for centuries. She smiled. Adjusted her purse. And asked the only question that actually mattered. How long have you known? Junho told Seo-yun everything in the back of the car. Not because he wanted to. Because secrets had stopped being optional the moment those 3 children looked at him with his own face. For years ago there'd been a power shift. An old guard dying. New territory opening up. Junho was rising fast, making moves that threatened men who'd held souls underground for decades. They couldn't touch him directly. He was too careful. Too protected. So they looked for softer targets. They found Hygiene. Her name appeared in the wrong conversation. A bartender who talked too much. A photograph taken outside Junho's apartment. A file passed up the chain with a simple notation. Leverage. The order came down 3 days later. Not official. Never official. Just a whispered contract. A price. A timeline. Make it look random. Make it hurt. Send a message. Junho found out because he'd paid the right people to hear the wrong things. He had 72 hours. Maybe less. He could have told her. Could have explained that loving him meant wearing a target. Could have hidden her, relocated her, surrounded her with enough security to make any attempt suicide. But men like the ones who'd put the order out didn't care about security. They cared about symbols. About showing that no one was untouchable. Not even the woman sleeping beside Seoul's rising kingpin. And Hygiene would never have left him. He knew that. She'd have stayed. Fought. Become exactly the kind of visible, stubborn, loyal target that made examples worth making. So Junho made a different choice. He became the cruelest version of himself. Said things designed to make her hate him. Convenient. Distraction. Not strong enough. Every word a calculated blade. He watched her crumble, and told himself it was mercy. When she walked out, he made sure the right people knew. Made sure words spread through the channels that mattered. That he'd discarded her. That she meant nothing. That touching her would be pointless. No leverage in a woman he'd publicly destroyed. The order was quietly rescinded. Redirected. Forgotten. Hyejin disappeared into the city, and Junho told himself he'd saved her life. He never knew she was pregnant. Never knew that saving her meant condemning her to 4 years of poverty and fear and raising 3 children alone on wages that barely covered rent. Never knew that his noble lie had sentenced her to exactly the kind of slow destruction he'd been trying to prevent. The truth explained everything. Why he'd been so brutal. Why he'd cut so deep. Why he made absolutely certain she'd never come back. And it fixed nothing. Because Seohyun sat across from him in leather seats worth more than Hyejin's yearly income and said what needed to be said. You saved her from a quick death and gave her a slow one instead. Junho had no answer for that. Because some choices don't have good outcomes. They only have different kinds of damage. And the man who'd built an empire on calculated violence had miscalculated the one thing that mattered. That survival without support isn't salvation. It's just a longer way to break. Junho learned everything in 48 hours. Not from her. She wouldn't have told him if he'd begged. He learned it the way he learned everything. Through people who owed him favors and people who feared him and people who simply knew that information was currency in his world. 3 months behind on rent. Eviction notice posted 2 weeks ago. Final deadline in 5 days. A CPS case opened 6 months prior. Missed appointments. Warnings. A home visit scheduled for the same week the eviction was set to process. 1 sick child. Medication rationed. Clinic bills unpaid. The math was simple and devastating. In 5 days Hyejin would lose the apartment. In 6 days the state would determine she couldn't provide stable housing. In 7 days his children would enter the system. And it would be his fault. Not directly. Not technically. But fault didn't care about technicalities. He'd saved her from a bullet and sentenced her to this instead. Junho showed up on the 5th day. Not alone. Not quietly. He arrived with lawyers. With paperwork. With a bank representative and a housing specialist and every official document required to prove that these children had a father. That he was present. Financially stable. Willing. The caseworker was a woman in her 40s with tired eyes and a folder thick with cases exactly like this one. She looked at Junho the way people in her position always looked at men in his. Skeptical. Unimpressed. Expecting performance over substance. He didn't perform. He stated facts. His name. His relationship to the children. His willingness to accept paternity testing. His intention to provide financial support. His understanding that this didn't erase 4 years of absence. The caseworker glanced at Hyejin. Waiting for confirmation. For permission. Hyejin stood in the doorway of the apartment she was about to lose, arms crossed, face unreadable. She didn't say yes. She didn't say no. She just looked at Junho like he was a stranger who happened to share DNA with her children. The caseworker asked the required questions. Junho answered each one. No excuses. No explanations that mattered. Just acknowledgement. Yes, he had been absent. Yes, he had failed to provide support. Yes, he understood the harm caused. When the paperwork was signed, when the accounts were established, when the immediate crisis had been temporarily averted, the caseworker and the lawyers and the officials left. Hyejin stood in the kitchen where dinner had been rice and rationed eggs. Where bills had piled up like accusations. Where she made survival look like living for 4 years without help. Junho stood in the doorway. The man who'd built an empire on the principle that he bowed to no one. And he dropped to his knees. Not romantic. Not pleading. Not asking for forgiveness he didn't deserve and wouldn't receive. Just kneeling. On cracked linoleum in an apartment that smelled like mildew and someone else's cooking. Submitting to the only truth that mattered. That he'd failed. That power meant nothing if it protected no one. That some debts couldn't be paid. Only acknowledged. Hyejin looked down at him. And said nothing. Because some silences were more final than words. 6 months later, the children were safe. The apartment was paid for. A year's lease. Then another. Rent deposited automatically on the first of every month from an account hygiene never touched otherwise. Medical bills cleared. The clinic no longer looked at her with pity when she brought Jaehoon in for his persistent cough. Good insurance now. The kind that didn't require rationing prescriptions or choosing between medicine and food. CPS closed the case. Stable housing. Consistent income. Adequate care. The words on the final report were clinical. Bureaucratic. They didn't mention the 4 years before. Didn't mention that stability had come from the same man who'd made instability necessary. Minjun started school. Real school, not the waiting list she'd been on for 2 years. Suah got glasses she actually needed instead of squinting through life. Jaehoon stopped coughing. The apartment was still small. Still smelled like other people's cooking. But it was theirs. Secured. No longer balanced on the edge of disappearing. Junho came by once a week. Saturday mornings. Never unannounced. Never demanding. He'd knock and wait. Sometimes hygiene let him in. Sometimes she didn't. When she did, he sat with the children. Played simple games. Listened to rambling stories that went nowhere. Learned their favorite colors and their least favorite foods and which stuffed animal belonged to whom. He didn't try to be their father. Didn't demand affection or recognition. Just showed up. Consistently. The way he should have from the beginning. The children accepted him the way children accept most things. With cautious curiosity that slowly became comfort. They didn't call him father. He never asked them to. Hygiene watched from the kitchen. Never joining. Never leaving. Just present. Witnessing. Making sure. One Saturday, after the children had fallen asleep during a movie, Junho stood to leave. Hygiene walked him to the door. He paused. Not dramatically. Just stopped. Like there was something that needed saying, but he wasn't sure he had the right. She waited. Thank you, he said quietly. For letting me. She looked at him. Really looked. At the man who'd destroyed her to save her. At the father who'd missed everything that mattered. At the stranger who shared DNA with her children and nothing else. I didn't do it for you, she said. Her voice wasn't cruel. Just factual. I did it for them. Junho nodded. I know. And that was it. No declaration of love. No plea for forgiveness. No redemption arc that tied everything together neatly. Just acknowledgement that some things stayed broken. That showing up didn't erase absence. That money solved crises but didn't heal wounds. He left. She locked the door behind him. And in the small apartment that was finally, impossibly safe, Hygiene looked at her sleeping children and understood that survival came in different forms. Some loud and desperate. Some quiet and permanent. Power had saved them. But it couldn't give back the 4 years she'd endured alone. Couldn't undo the nights she'd cried in bathrooms so the children wouldn't hear. Couldn't erase the woman she'd become when love turned into abandonment. Some wounds don't close. They just become part of who you are. Subscribe for more stories where power doesn't escape consequences. Where love doesn't fix everything. And where some debts can never be repaid. Only acknowledged.